So the next thing we're going to cover is chapter 6, which is gigantic, and I have kind of a problem with Stephen Lin trying to cram this much stuff into one chapter, especially stuff that kind of sort of doesn't really go together that well, I think, but as long as it's all covered and you get to practice all of it in the class, I guess I don't really care too much. You'll notice that I have the list of stuff covered in chapter 6 a little bit out of order here in terms of how I've listed it here and then how I'm going to cover it, so I hope that doesn't create confusion. But here's a great big list of all of the stuff covered in this chapter. So historical criticism, new historical criticism, biographical criticism, cultural studies, Marxist criticism, and post-colonial criticism. And I guess maybe to Lin's credit, one reason that he might have put all of this stuff in one chapter is that all of these modes of criticism are about placing a text in a specific context in terms of theory or time period or like historical context. I guess they all have to do with that. So biographical criticism is one school of criticism that's covered in this chapter, and it involves researching an author's life. Oops, typo. That should say an author's life, not and author's life. Yeah, always notice stuff like that when you're already in the process of narrating the slides. Anyway, involves researching and writing an author's life to determine how it may have shaped his or her writing. So first of all, don't assume somebody's writing is autobiographical. You've got to find that link, and the way that you do that is to research an author's life. And also avoid using biographical research as a replacement for analysis and interpretation. A lot of the time, biographical criticism kind of feels safe to students who are wary of doing analysis and who find that they don't like it, and they'll kind of delve into biographical criticism as a way to avoid that, and they end up writing a report. So what I mean by that is I'll get an essay that instead of analyzing a primary source like a poem or a short story, gives a big narration of an author's life and kind of says this is what the author did and this is what his life was like, and doesn't really focus on the poem or short story at all, or it does so in a really surfacey kind of way, just in passing. So try to avoid doing that, or you won't really be doing what I'm asking you to do in essay 2. And I'll show you how you might do biographical criticism well. So on page 147, there's this John Milton poem, and I think it's called When I Consider How My Life Is Spent. I'd have to go back and look now, and I didn't put the title on the slide, but I think that's what my light is spent. Did I say that, or did I say life? Anyway, I think it's called When I Consider How My Light Is Spent. And so when you look at page 147, you read the poem, then you can see how Stephen Lin uses biographical research to deepen his analysis of the poem. So he has kind of a research question, a question guiding his research, and then he finds some specific stuff about Milton's life, namely that he's going blind as he's writing the poem, to kind of analyze the poem more in depth and give him some more information as he's analyzing it. So he's not just focusing on Milton's life, he's focusing intensely on the poem and then using what he's found about Milton's life to focus on it even more intensely. So this is a good model for what you should be doing if you choose to do biographical criticism. Historical criticism works pretty much the same way as biographical criticism, except instead of looking solely at an author's life, you would look at kind of the context that the piece was produced in and what was going on in the world at the time when it was written. And for that reason, biographical criticism and historical criticism work well together. So if you choose to use one, you might choose to use the other and just kind of find that it's natural, and that's fine. So you can combine two approaches in this assignment, which I'll be covering in a few minutes. So anyway, historical criticism involves researching the historical context in which a literary work was produced to determine whether and how the context may have influenced the work. So make sure you don't use historical research as a replacement for analysis and interpretation, just as I just mentioned you should avoid doing when you're doing biographical criticism. New historical criticism is the same thing as historical criticism, but it has a different view of history, and we're kind of splitting hairs here. It might not matter too much for our class, but since the book covers it, I'll cover it too, and it's kind of interesting. So new historical criticism is kind of just a way to look at history differently, and as such to do analysis from a historical standpoint differently. So new historical critics see history not just as a simple story, but as a collection of competing narratives constructed by different people. So you may have heard that phrase, history is written by the winners or something. That's kind of an idea that goes along with this. Everybody has their own version of history. None of them is right, none of them is wrong. They're all just from different perspectives. So that's what a new historical critic would kind of be thinking. A new historical critic thinks of history as a text because we are not in history anymore. We're in the present moment. So all we have of history are a series of competing texts. So we have stories, we have videos, we have firsthand accounts, we have all kinds of different things by which we can glean what happened in history. And so for that reason, new historical critics kind of see history as a construct. This is a debatable idea, but there it is. History influences literature is another idea that's important to historical critics, but also history influences, but also literature influences history, and in a way, literature is history and history is literature. I don't know. Anyway, so an example of a very short story, an example of historical criticism is if you read a very short story by Ernest Hemingway, which is in one of the chapters we're covering in this lecture. I think it's chapter 4. I just spaced out for a second. I think a very short story is in chapter 4, reader response criticism. So when you read this short story, you could, after you read it, if you're trying to figure out what it means and what's important about it, you could research which war was going on when this story was written, what life was like for soldiers who fought in it and survived, what life was like for doctors and nurses who cared for injured soldiers. This would be a way to kind of research the historical context of the story in a focused way that specifically dovetails with an analysis of the story. You could also research how romantic relationships were changing during this time. Cultural studies is a big, huge, confusing academic field that is interdisciplinary. So it sits at the intersection of a bunch of different other academic fields such as anthropology, history, literature, philosophy, political science, and sociology. And central to cultural studies is this notion that there's no correct culture, there's no better culture than others, they're all just different and interesting. But also central to cultural studies is this notion that no culture is immune to critique. So you can always criticize a culture, you can always analyze it and decide what ideology it operates based on and whether that's kind of good or bad. It's kind of simplistic, but you get the idea maybe. So Lynn covers this field in chapter 6. I don't know how clear his coverage is. You can Google it if you're interested. You can look up a definition of cultural studies if you want more information about it. There's a lot of information about it on the web because there are a lot of cultural studies departments at the moment across the nation. So an example of how to apply cultural studies to a literary text would be if you read that excerpt from A Description of a City Shower by Jonathan Swift on page 151. You could imagine researching kind of the cultural context, not just the historical context, but the specific cultural context of this piece. So what was daily life like for people in London when this poem was written? What level of hygiene, I think it was written about London anyway. I'd have to go back and check, but my mind is telling me London, so I'm going to just go with it. If I'm wrong, sorry. What level of hygiene and sanitation was the average Londoner, I believe, person? What level of hygiene and sanitation was this average person used to during this time and at this place? So what was culturally normal? And how do all of these cultural norms kind of inform this piece? And how are they different from what we would expect now? So we're now maybe grossed out by this. Would people at the time have been grossed out by it? And you can see Lynn's analysis covering A Description of a City Shower following the piece. Marxist criticism is covered in this chapter also. Whew, there's a lot of stuff in this chapter. I'm getting tired. You probably are too. So Marxist criticism is a school of criticism that has a name that's slightly, if not entirely, misleading. I mean, you don't have to be like a Marxist or an extreme leftist or communist to do it. I guess it doesn't hurt, but you don't have to be. Really, if you're doing Marxist criticism, all you're doing is focusing on how social class, labor, work, money, stuff you buy and sell, commodities, how are these things represented in a piece of literature, favorably or unfavorably, or what effect do they have? So this school of criticism does draw on the thinking of Karl Marx, and it applies this kind of thinking to literary texts. Specifically, this school of criticism draws on Marx's theories about how capitalist societies are structured and the effects they have on individual people, specifically the working class. So Marx focused on the plight of the working class. Marxist criticism tends to focus on the plight of the working class, but it doesn't have to. And you don't have to if you're doing it. Not so much does Marxist criticism focus on his thinking about how the working class should like rise up and overthrow the existing power structure and force us all to be communists. It more just focuses on kind of, again, how these things are represented in literature. These things being social class, labor, money, commodities, that kind of stuff. So an example of this would be if you read When I Consider How My Light is Spent, then you'll see that well after the poem is introduced, I believe, on page 158 and 159, there's this analysis that Stephen Lin provides of this poem from a Marxist standpoint, and he focuses on the term day laborers because this would interest a Marxist critic. Day laborers being a term that kind of has overtones or undertones, I don't know, of the working class. So you can see Marxist criticism in action if you read Stephen Lin's analysis of this poem focusing on day laborers. Post-colonial criticism is the last school of criticism in this chapter. We're almost done, guys. So it's rooted in the theories of Edward Said and his seminal work Orientalism, which was a work that kind of changed the way we in the West view our own kind of preconceptions of the East and maybe racist attitudes toward the East. This was a text that I think came out in 1971, but I'd have to check my dates there. I think it was in the 1970s. So Said theorized that the West had colonized parts of the East, so West being like, Britain, and East being maybe like China or something. Not only physically, but also intellectually by defining it from a Western perspective as this place that was like exotic, mysterious, fundamentally different from the West. So if you see old movies that kind of portray the East as this place that's very mysterious and confusing and exotic and no one could ever understand it and it's full of like mystical ideas, this is the kind of stuff he's talking about. So there's this idea that the West is, from our perspective, like normal, and the East is the other. It's this other place where everything is different and weird and strange and cool. And so he tried to sort of break down this binary in his book, and you can see that his thinking draws on the thinking of structuralism and deconstruction, because he's trying to kind of break down the East-West binary in the same way that Derrida tried to break down binaries in general. So post-colonial criticism, when you're applying it to literature, often involves looking for colonial relationships in literature and analyzing them. It's as simple as that. And so colonial relationships could include relationships between people that, like, somebody's living in a land and then that land is colonized, and then you end up with these two groups of people, the colonizers and the colonized. So that's one kind of literal interpretation of colonial relationships. But then also there are sort of like metaphorically colonial relationships, I guess. Like you could see parent-child relationships as colonial in a way, romantic relationships maybe, especially when they're not so good, I guess. Teacher-student relationships even, or like teacher-class relationships. So often these other types of relationships are portrayed as kind of colonial. So you'll see like a piece of literature portraying a parent as ruthlessly imposing his or her will on a child and controlling the child and seeing the child as this like other being that's different from itself or whatever, him or herself. Anyway, if you see a relationship like that, you might start thinking about post-colonial criticism and it might interest you. So an example of post-colonial criticism would be if you read the poem Did I Miss Anything by Tom Wayman on page 103. We're not in post-colonial territory there. That's not the post-colonial section of the book. But if you read this poem, which I think is introduced and analyzed from the perspective of reader response criticism in the book, you could think about what the poem reveals about the power dynamic between the student and the teacher. So what kind of power does the student have? What kind of power does the teacher have? Is the teacher just imposing his will on the student? Is the teacher in like a dialogical relationship with the student? Is it more complicated than that? So does it look